sorry for cutting that off. As I was saying, Constantine converts to Christianity, and all of a sudden Christianity has a transformation from being a religion for minorities, for the outsiders, for slaves, for women, for the disempowered people in the Roman world, a real religion of a minority, and a disempowered minority at that. All of a sudden, with Constantine, Christianity is still at first a minority in Roman society, but now it's going to be a very privileged minority. Bishops are being invited to court, being asked to advise the emperor. Gifts are being lavished on Christian churches. They're getting all sorts of wealth. They're getting donations. They're getting legal privileges, a whole very, very rapid turnaround. And this is going to, I think, haunt Christianity for a long time thereafter. This very sudden transition from being an impoverished, persecuted, outsider kind of a religion, really focused on the other world and on how it's sort of looking for treasures in heaven, to suddenly being a very powerful, wealthy, influential institution in this world. That's something that Christianity is really going to have to wrestle with. From Constantine's time onward, we see the growth of what we call imperial Christianity. You're going to have more and more high-status people, highly educated people converting to Christianity. Christian churches are going to become more and more prominent as powerful, wealthy, influential local institutions. The bishops of the churches are going to become extremely influential officials in their various cities. Just a lot of transformations like this. Ultimately, we'll reach the point by maybe, into the 500s or 600s where Christianity is actually becoming the majority religion for most people in the society, and not just a minority. But that will take time to emerge. One area where it's sort of interesting to see this transformation of Christianity is when you look at the buildings that get used for church buildings. Christianity is very much the emperor's religion, very tightly tied to imperial patronage in lots of ways. So when Christians start to put up churches, back when it was illegal, they used to just take private houses and convert them over for church use, knock out a couple walls, make a bigger kind of a meeting room in them, that sort of a thing. But now they've got the opportunity to actually put up whole buildings of their own. Interestingly, they don't build churches to resemble pagan temples. Okay, they really take a different architectural approach and look for a different type of a building, not a pagan temple. Instead, what they do is they build basilicas. And I'll make a picture available to you to see what a basilica looks like. But it's a very particular architectural style in the Roman Empire, with a long rectangular nave, sort of a main central rectangular part of the building, and then a semicircular part at the end called an apse. The idea being that the people assemble in the rectangular nave, and then the presiding official, like a governor or a judge, would sit at the apse. This was normally a Roman government building that might be used as a law court or as a imperial audience hall, that kind of a thing. But this is the model that gets taken over for Christian churches, which means if you're a citizen of a Roman city and you're walking down the street and you come to the Christian church, you're going to see a building that doesn't look like a temple to you. It looks like a law court. It communicates authority and power, and that really kind of signifies this transition of Christianity, not stepping so much into the shoes of the old pagan religion, but very much closely identifying itself with its powerful imperial patrons. That's a very important issue. Now, with all this patronage coming in, Constantine still wants to make sure, and all the other emperors after him, they still want to make sure that God, now instead of the gods, is guaranteeing the well-being of the empire. Right? In the old pagan system with civic paganism we spoke about before, you need gods because they guarantee that the sun shines and the rain falls and the crops grow and diseases stay away and people fall in love and get pregnant and bear children to be the next generation, and that the army wins its battles. Well, you still need God to do that, right? It's no longer going to be a whole bunch of different gods, it's going to be one God. And therefore, it is as important as ever to make sure that the emperor is keeping on the good side of God. You want to keep God friendly. Now, with Christianity, this is going to pose a little bit of a problem, though, because once Constantine has legalized Christianity, he discovers that there actually are all kinds of different sorts of Christianity, and all these people hate each other. They're having all sorts of arguments about what God is really like and who Jesus really is and who you baptize and who you don't, and all sorts of issues like this. There's a lot of different theological disputes in Christianity, a lot of different divisions, and all the different branches of Christianity are condemning each other for being heretics. Now, back when Christianity was illegal, if one group of Christians thought another group of Christians were heretics, what could you do about it? Well, you kick them out of your church and say we don't want them anymore, and then they might go off and form their own group. But there wasn't really any more punishment beyond that, right? You're all practicing an illegal religion, so there's not much you can do other than split up and go have separate churches doing separate things. But now with Constantine, there's a much more pressing issue. You can't just kick people out of the church. The issue is which of all these groups is going to get imperial patronage, and how does God feel about all the other groups, right? Which group is the real Christian church that you're going to give patronage to, the proper Christian church, the right teaching Christian church that's going to get the imperial gifts and favors and that sort of thing. And if you pick the wrong one, if you choose heretics and start giving patronage to them, maybe God's not going to be so happy with you, right? So with Constantine, in this period of imperial Christianity, it becomes really, really important for the emperors to sort out what real Christianity is supposed to look like, right? What does it mean to be a real Christian, a right-teaching Christian, what they call an orthodox Christian, right? Orthodox from the Greek meaning right teaching. Catholic has a similar meaning, by the way. The two words get used interchangeably in the ancient world. Catholic means universal, or literally according to the whole. What does the whole universal church teach, as opposed to, split off groups of heretics. So what Constantine does in order to resolve this is he calls Christian leaders, the bishops, together for councils. And you get what are called ecumenical councils, councils that bring together bishops from the whole Roman world to discuss the big theological issues of the day, right? Who is God and what's the nature of God, and who is Jesus Christ and what's his nature? The first and one of the most important of these councils meet at the city of Nicaea, which is in Roman Asia Minor. They come up with a document they call the Nicene Creed. Actually, it gets developed later on, the later Council of Constantinople, to become the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, but usually we just call it the Nicene Creed. And here they're laying out these sort of ideas. Who is God? Is there one God? Well, who is Jesus Christ? They develop this idea of a Trinity, which don't have too much time to go into. But the important thing is that these councils, like the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Ephesus, the Council of Constantinople later on, these various councils are laying out official Christian teaching and enforcing them, right? If you don't follow this, you get condemned as a heretic, and then you're not necessarily going to get executed. You're not going to have many executions for heresy, not until the very, very end of the Roman Empire, and then not very often. But you will get denied patronage. Okay, you'll get stern imperial commands to stop, and you'll get cut off from imperial patronage. Heretics and heretical churches will not be getting the advantages, and you'll get a certain amount of legal suppression. People will get arrested, thrown into jail, losing offices, that kind of a thing. So there is a persecution turning around against heretical Christians on the part of Orthodox Christians with the support of the imperial government. So this really brings a new element into Christianity, this kind of forceful enforcement of norms of orthodoxy and an attempt to determine what right teaching is and penalize people for not following it. Another aspect, though, maybe on the more positive side, or the silver lining to all this repression, is that the debates over orthodoxy and what the right teaching is going to be means that you're going to see a lot more intellectual sophistication coming into Christianity. You're getting more educated people now as Christianity is becoming more privileged, more upper class. They've got much more access to Greek and Roman philosophy, and they're starting to sort of that and look at their Christianity in the light of philosophy, look at philosophy in the light of Christianity, look for common ground and which kinds of philosophies or philosophical ideas fit in well with Christianity, which ones don't fit in. And as a result, in the 4th and 5th centuries, you see a real flourishing of Christian intellectual life, which manages to incorporate a lot of the ideas of the older Greek and Roman philosophers. And that's a very important development. Christianity philosophizes itself, makes itself into a philosophical religion. This is a process that had started in earlier debates back in the 200s, but really with the 300s and 400s, this is going to be a much more developed process, a lot more intellectual sophistication resulting. Okay, so that's sort of a few of the high points, first of all, taking a look there. So a few things is you now have an imperial church very closely associated with the emperor's authority, really getting a lot of influence, getting a lot of power, getting a lot of wealth, a lot of control in local societies, and you start getting an increasing need or urge or drive to identify orthodox Christian belief, distinguish it from heretical belief, and make sure that imperial patronage is getting channeled into the orthodox churches and being kept away from the heretical churches, which are then being persecuted and suppressed with varying degrees of success, not all of them very successfully. Okay. Finally, this brings us to one other aspect of imperial Christianity, and this is the last section that we need to talk about, looking at today's topic of this late imperial system. And that is, not everybody in the Christian world is happy with this sudden transition into Christianity becoming this wealthy, privileged kind of institution. They remember the good old days when being a Christian was something that would get you martyred. They remember the idea that suffering is what brings you closer to God, not being wealthy and prosperous and powerful. They look back to the martyrs as the heroes of the church, people who left the world behind and rejected the world because they preferred to keep their faith. What do you do if you see Christianity that way? If you want to look back to the old days when Christianity was a religion for the persecuted, powerless few, the true believers who were on their way to heaven. Well, the government's not going to martyr you anymore, at least not unless you're a heretic, and not even really then, apart from throwing you in jail. So what else can you do? Well, if the government will not martyr you, you're going to have to do it yourself, in a sense. Now, not killing yourself, suicide is contrary to Christian ethics, but you get the rise of a movement which focuses on a way of life which is all about denying the world, leaving the world, separating yourself from worldliness. Okay, and in that sense is very much a criticism of the wealthy, powerful church that the bishops' churches in the cities are kind of turning into. We call this an ascetic movement. I'll give you the spelling when I can. An ascetic movement. It's not new with Christianity. The world, and even Western civilization, had ascetic movements before. We haven't drawn much attention to them yet in this class. You see them in some religious movements. There are of Judaism that practice asceticism. You also see it in certain Greek philosophical circles. The Cynics that we spoke about beforehand, I called them kind of the hippies of the ancient world. They also would practice a kind of asceticism. Asceticism is based on our old duality, that chart I gave you beforehand about Greek arete, right? The sense of virtue, which is rooted in an understanding that a person is composed of body and soul, and that the body is irrational and passionate and has all these desires. It has hungers, it has lust, it has fear and cowardice because it wants to preserve itself, or it might get roused up into being angry and bloodthirsty and that kind of a thing. All these things are passions, and the virtuous life, the good life, requires that this irrational, passionate body be controlled by the rational, virtuous, immortal soul, right? Remember that? Well, asceticism takes that logic to an extreme and says, okay, if you want to lead a truly righteous life, a truly spiritual life, what you need to do is completely put the body under the control of the soul to the point that you deprive the body of any gratification of its desires. Okay? So ascetics, in order to elevate the life of the soul and really put the soul in charge and create a pure and righteous soul, you deny the body, you deprive the body. So, for example, your body wants food, you practice fasting, right, and practice periods of deprivation of food. Your body wants sleep. Well, instead of falling asleep, you stay up all night praying. You practice a prayer vigil, right? Sleep deprivation. Your body wants sex. You practice celibacy. Okay, so on and so forth. All these kinds of measures that you might take, all in order to discipline the body, control the body, deprive the body, and thereby, the logic is, elevate the power of the soul, purify the soul from the passions that come out of the body, and allow it to live a higher, more spiritual life. As I said, some Greek philosophers had already been practicing things like this, especially the Cynics, to a lesser extent members of other philosophical schools like the Neoplatonists. There were branches of Judaism that were experimenting in things like this, some other religious movements experimenting in this kind of thing. As Christianity becomes legal, you get an ascetic movement within Christianity. Broadly speaking, we call it monasticism. Okay, monasticism, the rise of an ascetic movement within Christianity. It mostly emerges initially in Egypt, for whatever reason, possibly because of things are already going on in Egypt at the time, possibly because the desert is sort of right there inviting you out to live the ultimate life of deprivation. Egypt is sort of the birthplace of Christian monasticism, spreads very rapidly across other parts of the Middle East from there into Christians living in Syria and Palestine and Asia Minor. Eventually it's all over the empire, but it really originates in the East, and Egypt is usually seen as sort of the motherland of a Christian monasticism. There are two different varieties of monasticism in Roman Christianity. The first one we call eremitic monasticism. Eremitic monasticism. We get the word hermit from eremitic monasticism. It comes from the Greek word eremos, which means the desert. The idea to eremitic monasticism is that you practice a life of solitude and isolation, right? The hermit, the eremitic monk, goes out into the desert by himself in order to live a life of deprivation. After all, out in the desert, you're not going to have a lot of food or any of these, access to women or any of these other kinds of things. So the eremitic monks, solitary in the desert. In Egypt, it's a literal desert, in Syria too, to a greater extent. When monasticism spreads elsewhere, they'll go into the hills or into the woods, and they'll count desert meaning wilderness rather than sand and rocks. But as long as you're in a wilderness, isolated kind of a place, you can be a hermit and practice eremitic monasticism. So out there you fast and you pray and you meditate and you do all these kinds of things. The understanding in the Roman world is actually that in civilization, right, in human society, you're bound to sin, right? Dealing with other people is just sort of inevitable. Human society is irredeemably corrupt, and if you ever want to sort of get the issues clear, you need to pull away from it and separate out from it and learn how to wrestle with sin, without all the engagement and entanglements of worldly life, the need to make a living and raise a family and all that kind of stuff. At the same time, though, it's not that they think that the desert is pure and good. Actually, it's the opposite. Human society may be corrupt, but the desert is the homeland of the devil, right? The devil lives in the wilderness to a great extent. And so when these hermits, like St. Anthony in Egypt, he's sort of one of the founding fathers of monasticism, when they go out into the desert, they don't go out into a place that's pure and clean and righteous. They're going out into a place where they're sort of invading the devil's home territory and doing battle with the devil. And you'll get stories told about them that, people will go to visit, the cave where the hermit is living, and they'll hear inside sort of, these great battles and blood-curdling shrieks and screams and things like that go on. And, and they'll go in and talk to the hermit. He says, he was fighting the devils and that kind of thing. You sort of wonder what was really going on to give rise to these sort of episodes. But this is sort of the image, as you're going out there doing battle with the devil, where the sun can be drawn more clearly. You can see sort of, the devil here and God there, whereas in human society it's all sort of jumbled together and impossible to disentangle. So hermetism, eremiticism, one key and in some ways sort of most heroic and most admired form of monasticism. But you also get another kind of a movement. Some people say, well, maybe not everybody is strong enough to become a hermit right away. That's kind of a rather extreme way to go. And also they look at Christian ethics and say, well, when we look in the Christian scriptures, we see that love and forgiveness are supposed to be very important ethical values for Christians to follow. And if you're living by yourself out in the desert, how are you going to practice love for anybody, right? There's nobody around there to love. You're supposed to be, bearing one another's burdens and giving to people and all that kind of a thing, and you can't really do all that stuff if you're off by yourself. So you get another kind of monasticism appearing very, very rapidly after eremitic monasticism gets started. It's called cenobitic monasticism, and I'll put up the spellings for you so you all can see how these words are written. Cenobitic monasticism comes from koinos bios in Greek, which means common life or shared life, life held in common. The idea, we don't have a separate word for cenobitic monks, we just call them monks. But here the idea is that instead of going off to a cave or someplace off in the wilderness by yourself, instead you're going to form a group. You're still going to withdraw from the world, you're still going to get away from settled civilized society, go to some sort of remote place, but you're not going to do it by yourself, you're going to do it in a group. Rather than living in a cave all by yourself, each of the monks is going to have a little cell, a little building or cottage, or maybe a room in a bigger building, something like that. And they're all going to gather together to have meals together. They may be practicing fasting, but you can't fast all the year round. You have to eat something or you'll die. So they'll have meals together, they'll have common worship services together, and they'll try to form a community based on ascetic principles, where they're sort of encouraging one another and keeping one another accountable and disciplining one another, and sort of urging one another onwards to more and more ascetic life so they could go higher and higher. In these kind of cenobitic monasteries, right now you're getting a monastic institution with these groups, the senior-most ascetics will be looked up to as fathers by the others, and so a word for father from the Middle East, Abba, gets to be used to refer to them, these sort of father figures who teach and guide the newer or younger monks in how they're supposed to live, and eventually this is going to lead to a new kind of an office in Christianity within monasticism, the office of the abbot, the head of a monastic community. And so these monasteries are going to be very, very, very important as sort of focuses, or foci, sorry, of Christian ideals. They're also going to become very important, we'll see, for Christianizing the countryside, because they're getting out of the cities and out into more remote kinds of areas. And monks are going to become very, very important for developing Christian culture as we start to move into the Middle Ages. Okay, so that is the late Empire. We started with politics and the anarchy and Diocletian, the creation of the dominate, very, very important, in the Tetrarchy. Talked about Constantine's rise to power and is really continuing this dominate style of rule. He changes the religion, but he keeps a lot of the other stuff. And then we talked about the rise of imperial Christianity, which means both Christian churches becoming a sort of a dominant, empowered, wealthy sort of an institution, influential institution. Means the rise of orthodoxy and church councils, which has as its dark side the condemnation and persecution of heresy, but also means a much greater intellectual sophistication in late Roman Christianity. And then we spoke about a sort of a counter movement, a countercultural movement, with the rise of Christian asceticism. That's the eremitic monks going off into the desert to caves and things. And also, most importantly of all, for this ascetic movement, monasteries, cenobitic monasticism, with this idea of a shared common life following Christian ideals, while still practicing poverty and asceticism and denial of the body and celibacy and these other kinds of things. Okay, so very good. This concludes this series of lectures on video for our first section here. I'm going to have another batch for the second section dealing with what happens to the Roman Empire and brings the Roman era to an end and gives birth to the Middle Ages. But that'll be next time. Thanks very much, everybody.